going on, guys? It's Cimo. So today I'm bringing to you a card discussion on Millennium-Eyes Restrict. In my opinion, the best and most sought after card to be released in Legendary Duelist Ancient Millennium. Now this card has a lot of really cool tricks up its sleeve, and considering the fact that it's a Pegasus inspired card, I guess that should really come as no surprise. But before we get into that, I want to give a big shout out to my newest patrons as always. So big shout out today to Nicholas as well as Devin for upping their pledge as well. You guys are the reason that this channel is growing strong. And if you guys want to help support me in the channel through Patreon, then check out the Patreon link in the description below. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So Millennium-Eyes Restrict is a dark level 1 spellcaster effect fusion monster with 0 attack and 0 defense. And the effect reads as follows. Once per turn, when your opponent activates a monster effect, as a quick effect, you can target one effect monster your opponent controls or in their graveyard. Equip that target to this card you control. This card gains attack and defense equal to that equipped monster's. Monsters with that equipped monster's name cannot attack. Also, their effects on the field and their activated effects are negated. So there's a lot to unravel here, and obviously we're not going to be summoning this through conventional means by using Relinquished and an effect monster. No, fuck that. We're going to be cheating this bad boy out onto the field utilizing Instant Fusion. As if Instant Fusion didn't have enough flexibility already, this is just another card you can add to that arsenal. So once we cheat out Millennium-Eyes Restrict onto the field, and since we have 3 copies of Instant Fusion, we have a very high likelihood of being able to do that. What are we trying to accomplish? Why is this card good? Well, I think the biggest reason why this card is so appealing to a lot of players, especially on the competitive level, is because it's very reminiscent of another card that we're going to be receiving rather shortly, Called by the Grave. Now, Called by the Grave obviously is a lot different from this card, but there's some striking similarities, and the big one is the fact that Millennium-Eyes Restrict can stop hand traps. So how does that work? Well, basically if you instant fusion Millennium-Eyes Restrict out onto the board, and let's say you're going about doing whatever plays your deck is capable of doing. Let's say you use an effect and your opponent uses a card like Ash Blossom or Ghost Ogre as Chain Link 2. Since a monster effect was activated, you can chain Millennium-Eyes Restrict as Chain Link 3 and target the card that they discarded to the graveyard, being the hand trap, because since the hand trap has to discard itself to the graveyard for cost, it is now a valid target for Millennium-Eyes Restrict to absorb. So now the chain will resolve backwards. Millennium-Eyes Restrict will equip the hand trap to itself, negating just blanket any effects with that card's name. So let's take for instance Ash Blossom. So now since that's negated, Ash Blossom as Chain Link 2 will now be negated, and your effect as Chain Link 1 will resolve as normal. So this works for any hand trap that has to discard itself to the graveyard for cost, which is basically all of them outside of like Psyframe Gear Gamma, but that means that this card can stop Ash Blossom, it can stop Ghost Ogre, it can stop Effect Veiler, it can stop Joel and Lockbird. Literally any card that says discard this card before the semicolon, this card is capable of equipping to itself and negating all effects with that card's given name. That's absolutely crazy, and that's something that people are looking forward to with Called by the Grave for the very same reason. But the difference is, we're not getting Called by the Grave until next month, whereas this card is now legal as of today, at the time of recording this video, in the TCG. However, there's 2 very distinct differences when it comes to Millennium-Eyes Restrict, as well as Called by the Grave. The thing is, Millennium-Eyes Restrict is more of a proactive resource, whereas Called by the Grave is a reactive resource. So what do I mean by that? Well, the thing is, when it comes to Millennium-Eyes Restrict, you have to have it onto the board before you're able to go off with your plays and prevent your opponent from using those hand traps. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it takes away the surprise factor, because if your opponent sees that you have a Millennium-Eyes Restrict onto the field, and let's say they have a hand trap in their hand, they're not going to be willing to use that hand trap because they know it's just going to get eaten up by the Millennium-Eyes, and if they're not going to die on the next turn, they're going to save that hand trap because Instant Fusion will destroy Millennium-Eyes Restrict during the end phase, and then you're going to have to deal with that hand trap on the next turn. Called by the Grave, in comparison, being a quick play spell, you're going to go on doing with whatever plays your deck does, and then your opponent's going to hand trap you, and then you can chain Called by the Grave from your hand, so there's a surprise factor there. And not only is there a surprise factor, but you got your opponent to waste the resource as well, rather than keeping it in their hand. Now, ultimately, if with Millennium-Eyes Restrict, you're able to assemble the board that you need to, and that ultimately wins you the game because your opponent couldn't hand trap you, then quite frankly, Millennium-Eyes Restrict did its job, and it didn't really matter in that instance whether or not it was Millennium-Eyes Restrict or Called by the Grave. However, just in the way that these cards interact, I think Called by the Grave is a better way to stop hand traps, but the fact that we have another card in the game that we can now use to stop hand traps, especially one that's so simple and just requires us to run instant fusion, is a very, very good thing, and a lot of decks are going to want to take advantage of this. Now, another application for a card like Millennium-Eyes Restrict is the fact that it can also negate the effects of monsters that tribute themselves for costs. Now, it's a little bit tricky because we can't use this during our opponent's turn because Instant Fusion is going to destroy the Millennium-Eyes during our end phase. So it's not going to work on something like Lone Fire Blossom because we're not going to have Millennium-Eyes on the field to be able to negate it. But that doesn't mean there aren't monsters that will tribute themselves during our turn, and one instance of that would be something like ABC Dragon Buster. If your opponent tributes off ABC Dragon Buster in an attempt to special summon the 3 pieces from their banish zone, you can use Millennium-Eyes Restrict as Chainlink 2, equip the Dragon Buster from the graveyard to the Millennium-Eyes Restrict, and now it's going to negate the Dragon Buster's effect, and not only will it negate it, but they're not going to have the 3 pieces on their board, and that's going to put them in a very, very bad position, because that means during their next turn, they're not going to have a follow-up, they're not going to be able to go into multiple Dragon Busters, they can't go into link plays, they're going to be very, very far behind, and that's where a card like Millennium-Eyes Restrict can really shine. But in addition to that, Millennium-Eyes Restrict just doesn't have to focus on monsters in the graveyard. It can also target monsters on the field, and that's where things can get a little bit nutty, because not only is it negating effects, but it's stealing your opponent's monsters as well, and that's a really big deal. Take for instance if you're going up against, let's say, a Pendulum player, and the Pendulum player just has a Vortex Dragon on the board. Well, if you start your turn by activating Instant Fusion, and if they let that Instant Fusion resolve, Millennium-Eyes Restrict is now on the board, you've effectively shut down that Vortex Dragon, because at any point if they try to use Vortex Dragon to negate any of your other cards, that's a monster effect activating. You can use Millennium-Eyes Restrict as Chainlink 3 to negate the Vortex Dragon, and you're basically in the hot seat. What's really cool about a card like Millennium-Eyes Restrict is the fact that as soon as it hits the board, it has an immediate presence, and it basically has to be dealt with in some form or another. Now, I know it's going to get destroyed in the end phase, but frankly, if your opponent doesn't have multiple forms of disruption, Millennium-Eyes Restrict can put in a lot of work, and especially when it comes to hand traps, especially if you're going first, being able to pull off your combos and assemble your board, whether it's unbreakable or not, is a really, really big deal, because now you're going to be free to go off, and it's going to be that much more difficult for your opponent to win the game in the long run if you're able to assemble a board of multiple negates or whatever it is that your deck is capable of doing. Millennium-Eyes Restrict is going to help you get there. I think this is a very, very solid card all around, and the fact that it's just toolboxed out through Instant Fusion is a really scary thing, because Pendulum FDK is becoming a very popular deck, so this just gives some more versatility to a card like Instant Fusion that if they don't necessarily go off with the FDK, if you draw Instant Fusion, you now have another card that you could go into that gives you, a little bit of versatility in your extra deck and options that Instant Fusion can go into, and that means you can go off with some of your plays. Hell, you can even throw in a regular Thousand Eyes Restrict just for some generic monster removal if you need to. This is just an all-around solid card. It obviously has its weak points as well, but for what it does at the current moment, the fact that it's an ultimate hand trap deterrent, the fact that as soon as it hits the board, it has an immediate presence, and your opponent has to deal with it, otherwise they're going to be in a very bad position. It's just all around solid card, and I think it's definitely something you're going to start to see a lot of play on moving forward into this format. But guys, those are just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about Millennium-Eyes Restrict as a whole. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. And if you found this video informative, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time. 1, 2, 3.